Excellent. Okay, well, everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending upon your current location. The presentation we're having today from Dr. Alexis Wick is a bit different from some of the public seminars we've had over the past couple of years. Whereas, rather predictably, we've been focusing on archaeology, on shipwrecks underwater, or port sites around the Mediterranean. Tonight, we're having something which I find, well, really quite exciting, because rather than focusing on archaeological material and shipwrecks, we're going to be taking a much bigger sort of synthetic picture. And what Dr. Alexis Wick is going to be talking about today is really embodied in his book and the title of it itself, which is called The Red Sea in Search of Lost Space. And so rather than looking at archaeological data, he's going to be examining the Red Sea both as a space and as a concept, and how that concept grew. Now, Dr. Alexis Wick received his doctorate in history from Columbia University in 2010, and he is a specialist in Ottoman, modern, and contemporary Arab history. And prior to his current post in the Department of History at Koç University, Dr. Wick was an assistant and associate professor of history at the American University in Beirut, where he was also the Mellon Faculty Fellow in 2018. Now, he has published extensively on the history of systems of thought and the production and politicization of space, and he has delivered numerous guest lectures at the University of Tübingen, for example, as well as Berkeley, and of course, AUB and Koç University. Now, today he's joining us to discuss his book published in 2016, titled, as I mentioned, The Red Sea in Search of Lost Space. Now, this book draws upon and synthesizes many of his scholastic strengths to generate a unique examination of how the Red Sea became, well, the Red Sea as we think of it today, both from a historical, a political, and a perceptual point of view. So, Alexis, it's great to see you. It's nice to see you in this environment as well as when I see you on campus. And honestly, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Matthew Hocam, thank you very much for this generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to join you this evening. Thank you also to Tuba Hanım and Zeynep Hanım, and more largely to the Koç University Mustafa Koç Maritime Archaeology Research Center, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and the American Research Institute in Turkey for this invitation to join their seminar series. I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you to everyone who is joining us this evening, or this evening in Istanbul at least. I want to talk to you a little bit today about, and I'm thankful for the opportunity, in fact, to return to this this book and think about its gestation and where it came from and the context in which it was produced. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and the discussion afterwards. So let me go dive straight in. Politics and history, even the most positivist scholar would admit, intersect in many ways, some explicit, others less so. After the end of the Cold War, and in the wake of the failure of nationalist and socialist projects of all sorts, there arose in academic circles the world over the idea that we had reached a post-ideological era, which would bring forth new scholarly paradigms and transcend the tainted and charged approaches of the ideological past, whether colonial or anti-colonial, where history was subjected to the constraining dictates of the political present. The first target of criticism, of course, was the nation state, reinterpreted as a smaller version of the colonizing system, where one social segment sought to impose its hegemony, economic, political, cultural, moral, on the rest of the population, imagined now as an organic totality. Nationalism, with its xenophobic essentialism, was the source of enormous oppression, reaching sometimes genocidal proportions, as we continue to see today, of course, and it had been abetted in its efforts to homogenize the extent of its territory and sometimes beyond, into a coherent whole by the history-geography complex, let me call it, flanked by a whole identity-making machinery, including most famously the map, the census, and the museum. The reference here is, of course, to Benedict Anderson's wonderful book, but also more widely, the whole spectrum of the ideological state apparatuses, whether repressive, the law, prisons, etc., or productive, schools, universities, literary canons, etc. Beyond the national frame, the associated area studies paradigm was equally contested as a product of colonial and Cold Warrior political agendas. The Middle East was one such category under attack. East of what? Middle of where? What does the category do? To whom? And for whom? Are there Middle Easterners in the Maghreb, as one scholarly playfully put it in an insightful recent intervention on the topic? Is Sudan in or out? And how about the Armenians and other peoples of the Caucasus? These were the types of questions on the menu as I was doing my graduate work, and they remain, I think, of course, of significant salience today. The term Middle East was put forth wasn't invented, but was crystallized in the writings of notably Alfred Thayer Mahan, an American geostrategist and historian, most famous for his theorization of sea power, not long before the dawn of the American century. And just as his friend, President Theodore Roosevelt, sent a glamorous fleet around the world in a Jules Verne-like show of manly force and aptitude, the category Middle East was particularly prone to the sentence of guilt by association. Other categories, obviously, were also, and area studies paradigms were equally contested. Africa, the Arab world, the Muslim world, etc. And this is where the sea came onto the scholarly scene with a bang. Free and fluid by nature and detached from the political and social, and therefore it was assumed the ideological, artificial, and non-scholarly bonds created by the land, the sea was seen by many as a providential way out of the damning constraints of the territorial ambitions of peoples and states. Seemingly devoid of the burdens of the recent past, and so obviously pregnant with great potentialities, the oceanic turn, as it has come to be known, this oceanic turn offered to deliver the discipline of history into the promised land of post-ideological and post-essentialist freedom. And without a doubt, sea histories present all the trappings of a new beginning, away from the control of neat, state-oriented narratives. The sea is by constitution a space of mixing and exchange, of impurity and anarchy, of danger and unpredictability, never quite under the sway of political elites. A maritime approach, then, provokes a heightened attention to the interconnectivity between peoples, places, goods, ideas, as opposed to the myth of pristine origins and the centripetal forces of the nation state. It forces us to pay attention to the pluricultural hues of port cities, to the polyglot sounds of seafarers. These are perhaps debatable characteristics, but I just want here to underscore the impulse behind these sea-related histories. The sense of thrill was palpable everywhere. I remember it very distinctly. Universities and scholars widely indulged the fashion, and the newly cohered oceanic turn gained as official a consecration as possible when the central organ of the discipline of history in the United States, the American Historical Review, hosted a forum dedicated to the theme, entitled Oceans of History, which collected magisterial state-of-the-art synthetic essays by leading figures in the fields of Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Pacific history, preceded by an introduction by Karen Wigan, a pioneer of the trend, who was also connected to the important Oceans Connect program at Duke University. Or so at least the story goes. But there was something uncanny about it all. Indeed, what I found so remarkable about recent sea-centered histories, often referred to as the new thalassology, from the Greek thalassa, sea, combined with the suffix logos, word, discourse, study, etc. What is remarkable about these sea histories is the constant appeal to novelty and neutrality. Thalassology, its practitioners claim, is one, a new approach to the field, and two, it is politically neutral. This is repeatedly affirmed. Now, it's never made completely explicit, but the new thalassology usually refers back to the great French historian Fernand Braudel, widely acknowledged as the forefather of this turn, almost prophetic in his vision and certainly unsurpassable in his achievement. The repeated assertions of the radical originality of sea-centered history, in fact, returns to Braudel himself too. In the opening of his magisterial book on the Mediterranean, first published in 1949, though having gestated throughout the 20s and 30s, and then indeed written in prison in a German labor camp during the war, Braudel, in the opening passages of this book, asserted that, quote, a historical study centered on a stretch of water has all the charms, but undoubtedly all the dangers of a new departure, end quote. Many years later, after not only his book, but reviews of his book had become classics, Braudel repeated explicitly that his main contribution remained that the demonstration that the Mediterranean constituted an integral whole and that its historical role had been great. Most startling, perhaps, as far as I was concerned, in this oceanic turn, for someone interested in Arab, Ottoman, Islamic perspectives on the past, was that not all maritime basins were created equal. Obviously, the Mediterranean, and the reference to Braudel is clear, the Mediterranean was primus inter pares, but some bodies of water did not even feature in the new thalassology, namely the Red Sea. And yet, the Red Sea presented the ideal features, it seemed to me, for a thalassological treatment. It was remarkably coherent from a natural point of view, but also from the perspective of its human dimension. The Red Sea is a long and narrow body of water oriented northwest-southeast that separates Africa from the Arabian Peninsula and connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Almost completely enclosed, its length runs for about 2,000 kilometers, while averaging 280 kilometers in width. Its only exit point is in the south, at the Gate of Lamentation, Bab el-Mandab, whose barely 30 kilometers are further constricted by the presence of islands. So it's really an enclosed sea. Though intimately connected to its surrounding regions, the Red Sea is a unique and coherent environment. The entire region lies along a major rift complex, which conditions the topography of the Red Sea world, characterized, as you can see in the image here to the left, or left at least of my screen, characterized by a deep trough along its central axis, the darker blue there, flanked by a shallow coastal shelf. This shelf is perhaps the most distinctive feature of these waters, for it is brimming with coral reefs. And if you haven't been, I can only urge you to go admire the wonders of the Red Sea corals. It is followed on land by a thin, also evident on this map, by a thin coastal plain, flanked very quickly by a dramatic uplift of the mountain ranges that dominate the length of the entire sea. On all sides, the coast suddenly ascends along steep, rocky mountains, separating that world, from the lands further afield. The Sinai Peninsula in the north, almost in its entirety, is formed by rugged mountains reaching an altitude of over 2,600 meters. Along the eastern shore, the coast abuts the Sarawat mountain range that runs from Jordan to the Gulf of Aden, cutting off the sea from the oasis-spotted desert and the lush plateaus in the south. The altitudes vary considerably, reaching over 2,500 meters in the north and over 3,600 meters near the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. But everywhere, the range falls abruptly onto the coast. And if you've been, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's quite a startling feature of the space. Indeed, the very word Hijaz evokes this topographic aspect. Hijaz means a barrier. It's a mountainous barrier that constitutes that region. In striking symmetry, the Red Sea Hills on the western coast this time, the Red Sea Hills of Egypt, Sudan, and Eritrea run almost continuously along the shore, leading up to the beginnings of the highlands of Ethiopia, where altitudes rise highest in the region at over 4,500 meters. The geological substratum also conditions another dominant characteristic of the Red Sea, its arid climate. Again, the name Tihama, in Arabic, the term for the length of the western seaboard, comes from a root meaning intensity of heat and stillness of air. Its surrounding shores are thus unreceptive to agricultural production due to high aridity and elevated temperatures. Rainfall is sparse and irregular, and there are no significant coastal rivers. The Red Sea world is thus also defined by its natural hostility to human settlement. This distinctive climatic factor concerns not only the land, but also the very waters, which are unusually warm and saline. The southern extensions of this space are much better watered, though neither the rains of the Ethiopian highlands nor the showers associated with the Indian Ocean monsoon reach the Red Sea. Instead, they break along the surrounding mountains that I just described. These features significantly impact life in and on the sea, with its uniquely rich palette of ecological features and fierce, unpredictable currents, resulting in serious navigational challenges. The abundance of reefs and corals, of which it has perhaps the highest concentration in the world, caused incessant worries to pilots and provides another important feature to any portrait of the Red Sea. The coral of the Red Sea has always been one of its distinguishing characteristics. Today, obviously, it appeals mainly to lovers of its underwater world. but it was once a crucial feature of the local architecture, from the structures of the ancient port city of Berenike to the Ottoman-era buildings of Sawakin and other coastal towns. Sawakin is in today's Sudan. The corals of the Red Sea served as material for construction, but they were also a significant source of income in local trade, among other features. The standard dictionaries of Ottoman language list Shab Denizi, the Sea of Corals, as a common name for at least parts of the sea. And the great Ottoman adventurer Evliya Çelebi uses the term as well. Besides reefs, there was the problem of the capricious currents. And the two are intimately connected, for they have a common origin in the geological conditions of the region. The high temperature and salinity of the waters provide an ideal setting for the nurture of various species of corals, just as they provoke differentials of density that lead to erratic underwater flux. The violent and impulsive winds, adding to these complications, were the most spectacular threat to ships sailing the Red Sea. These would regularly sweep through the narrow waterways that had to be navigated between the many reefs, islands, and coasts. This theme recurs often in the Ottoman documents involving navigation in the Red Sea, repeatedly evoking the destruction of ships due to the force of the winds. Şiddeti rüzgardan şikest olan sefine is a phrase that recurs commonly. The wind patterns were well known for millennia, and indeed they modeled the navigation of the sea in the first place, determining sailing seasons, paces, and even the disposition of ports. But there were also the more variable and intense winds that could not be mapped either in time or space. One regular feature of the wind regime splits the sea into two roughly equal navigational zones. The northern portion was governed by a unique wind regime that arranged the naval shuttle service between Suez and Jeddah on a cyclical basis. The southern part of the sea, by contrast, were subject to wind patterns resulting from the monsoon season of the Indian, common to the Indian Ocean. Ships from beyond Bab el-Mandab were therefore unlikely to pursue their travels north of Jeddah for fear of missing the return winds back to other parts of the Indian Ocean. From its earliest appearance in the documentary record, the Red Sea has featured as a liminal zone, a place in between. The very same conditions that made life and movement on the sea difficult also dictated the need for incessant navigation in the first place. Indeed, despite the inhospitable natural conditions, there were all around the coast and throughout the ages important cities. Commercial, political, symbolic, theological, of course, with the twin sacred cities of Mecca and Medina, not very far from the Red Sea coast. These cities could not live in autarky, and most were unsustainable in isolation from the sea itself, since the primary purveyors of the vital necessities were the agricultural lands along the Nile, mainly. As the great 15th century navigator Ahmad ibn Majid writes in his Kitab al-Fawaid, quote, the Sea of Qulzum al-Arab, one part of what we call the Red Sea, this sea is the most dangerous of all the seas of the world, and yet people use it more than all the seas of the world because of the ancient house and the pilgrimage of the Prophet, and because of the requirements of subsistence. There is clear evidence that this had already been the case in antiquity. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea mentions the export of grain from the ancient emporium of Berenike to ports on all sides of the Red Sea. Perhaps the most conspicuous material dearth in this nautical environment was the absence anywhere nearby of a source of adequate timber for the construction of boats. An elaborate network of transmaritime and transcontinental exchanges thus existed to make possible the crossing of the sea. At the core of the Red Sea, and this is evident from the Ottoman record, notably. At the core of the Red Sea as a historical actor then lay a tense paradox. Because of its strategic, commercial, and cultural importance, it had to have certain populations at various points along the sea. And yet it was thoroughly inhospitable. It absolutely had to be navigated, but for the same reasons, navigation of its waters was full of dangers. And given the absence of trees in the region, it could not produce ships in sufficient quantities and at an adequate speed. This too is evident in the Ottoman record, in which we can see the port in Istanbul often repeatedly requesting from its Cairene subordinates to buy Indian vessels to navigate the sea. In terms of human settlement, the fate of the port cities along the shore was always uncertain for these same reasons. The flow of traffic through the Red Sea over the centuries never ceased, but there's a striking variation over time in routes and ports along the way. Aden, Muha, Hudayda, Luhayya, Jeddah, Ayla, Tor, Qulzum, Suez, Qusayr, Aydab, Sawakin, Dahlak, Musawa, all of these and many more were at some point or another major centers of regional and interregional trade. Some of them today are mere ruins. Others saw their fortunes rise and fall and sometimes rise again. Only Jeddah demonstrates an unusual longevity, due no doubt to its central location in the middle of the sea, between the disparate wind regimes of the northern part of the sea and the southern part of the sea, and of course as a gateway to the noble sanctuaries of the Hijaz. The historical destiny of the Red Sea thus demonstrates a remarkable coherence. It was probably one of the earliest stretches of water to be regularly navigated, and it remains to this day a crucial thoroughfare, as the news will tell us from time to time, making it through the ages an object of enormous strategic, commercial, and symbolic value for powers near and far. All three Abrahamic faiths emerged on its shores: Moses in the west, Jesus in the north, and Muhammad in the east. And they first expanded along the contours of the Red Sea. Its various peoples spoke and speak mostly related Semitic languages. The cultural commonalities of the various shores are evident, and so overwhelming indeed was this coherence that throughout most periods of history, the Red Sea tended to orbit or to find itself within the orbit of a common polity. Certainly from 1517 onwards, it had belonged in its total or almost total extent to the well-protected domains of the Ottoman Sultan. Indeed, following in the footsteps of their Mamluk predecessors, the armies of Sultan Selim I conquered the lands surrounding the entire Red Sea in a highly deliberate, strategic move. Thereafter, almost all of the lands surrounding the Red Sea were in effect to remain within the Ottoman fold for 4 centuries, until the collapse of the empire in the 20th century. After which the region, along with the rest of the empire, obviously transmuted in the nation states recognizable today. The sole and partial exception is the particular case of Yemen, where the Imam of Sana'a succeeded by the second quarter of the 17th century, so more or less a century after the initial Ottoman conquests, to extend his authority back all the way down to the coast until the 19th century, when the Ottoman state once again returned. Obviously, the firmness, if you want, of the Ottoman presence varied depending on period and on area, but the Red Sea was clearly an Ottoman lake for 4 centuries. And yet, nobody had written a proper history of the Red Sea, whether in the longue durée or the short, and despite the oceanic turn and the fashion of the new thalassology. Why? And this then also became an object of my reflection in this research of mine on the Ottoman Red Sea. Why did the Ottoman Red Sea, or did the Red Sea not have its history? And this brings us back to the oceanic turn and to the concept of the sea more largely. The history of the Ottoman Red Sea, I argue in the book, has not been written in large part because of a long-standing identification of maritimity or the sea with Europe, and the collateral affirmation of the incompatibility of Islam, notably, and the sea. As other scholars have shown, and Palmyra Brummett notably has demonstrated well, there has long been a terrestrial bias in the conception of the Ottoman past. But more largely, I think what I seek to demonstrate in the book is that part of the reason has to do with the genealogy of the concept of the sea in and of itself. And contrary to what the new thalassologists argue, the foregrounding of the sea as a unified space runs all the way back to the institutionalization and the professionalization of the historian's craft in the early 19th century. So to the beginnings of historical writing as scientific history or objective history, if you want. Notably, in the work of the great philosopher Hegel. Hegel demonstrated, or argued, let's say, or theorized, rather, that water does not divide, despite common wisdom, but rather unites. It collects peoples, places, and things into a coherent whole. So he places seas and water basins, in fact, as at the center of his philosophy of. But it is an element that defines the special essence of Europe. Europe was constituted by its special connection to the sea. By contrast, explicitly, to non-Europeans who obviously had seas around them, but were detached from the maritime principle. Africa, Islam, the Orient, India, for Hegel, were defined, and his very influential philosophy of history, were defined by an essential landedness, territoriality. And this dictated their historical trajectory. Similarly, the connection to the sea dictated or permitted the particularity of European history too, and its attachment to freedom, to universality, to the openness to the other. This is Hegel arguing, obviously, that defines European history and that places at its center the principle of progress. The sea exists in Asia, but Hegel explains, quote, "It is without significance. The Asiatic nations have shut themselves off from it." By contrast, is of course the aquatic constitution of Europe, where, quote, "this maritime relationship is of vital importance, and it creates an enduring difference between the two continents of Asia and Europe." Hegel then formulates a definition of Europeanness that is as simple in its directness as it is revealing of his larger system. And this is explicitly in his philosophy of history. Incidentally, this is a portrait of the great philosopher, more or less at the time when he was in 1831, when he was lecturing on the philosophy of history at the University of Berlin, from which this text was constituted. The European state, quote, "the European state is truly European only insofar as it has links with the sea," end quote. It is the sea again and again in Hegel's writings that allows for the outward turn, that outlet which enables life to step beyond itself. These are his words, of course. And this is what leads directly to the most European of features, the principle of individual freedom, which defines life, according to Hegel, in Europe. By contrast, of course, in Asia, notably in India, for example, the inverse exists, and in India, people slavishly submit to the law, which is despotic and indeed freedom destroying. These are obviously his words, such as in the case of the caste system, which he says would be intolerable to seagoing people. The identification of the sea as the most important geographical element in the articulation of history and the key to the essence of the European self constitutes, I argue, one of Hegel's important legacies to Western historical discourse, of which we've largely inherited, in fact. The initial presentation of these concepts and ideas, however outlandish they might appear to us, actually paved the way, I think, for the subsequent amassing of a great deal of empirical data that then sought to affirm the identity of Europe and the sea and the contradiction between maritimity and the non-European. Hegel thus theorized the concept of the sea and gave us a proper concept of what the sea is, interlacing it from the very start with the concepts of Europe and of history. This dual helixed thalassocentric framework for understanding world history, where Europe ranges the sea and the non-European is bound by land, was not an invention of Hegel's, but with him and with his philosophical construction, it bequeathed to the historical discipline a particular conceptual disposition that persists until today in many forms. This tradition, the dual helix thalassocentric tradition, as I'm calling it, found its present-day consecration, for example, with the publication in the 1990s and early 2000s of two texts by eminent French scholars, Michel Mola du Jourdain, Europe and the Sea, and Xavier de Plagnol's Islam and the Sea, both of which obviously sought to underscore the intimacy of Europe and the sea, and the incompatibility of, in the case of Xavier de Planiol, the incompatibility of Islam and the sea. Thus, in addition then to exploring a kind of Brodelian history of the Red Sea in the Ottoman period, I think the centering of the Red Sea as a subject of history is a particularly fruitful place to think about how history makes its subject, to echo a famous title by a great anthropologist, Johannes Fabian, who sought to explore how anthropology made its object. Time and the Other is the title of the book. By homing in on the presence-absence of the Red Sea from the scholarly arena, despite the powerful natural and historical coherence unveiled, one is led to a set of fundamental questions concerning historical practice in general. What are the discursive procedures that enable an object to become a viable subject for history? How do particular subjects qualify as historical? How did the sea become a subject of historical analysis in and of itself? Should there be, can there be a universal history of the sea? Instead of a limited move that would seek inclusion of the Ottoman Red Sea into the realm of the discipline, what I tried to argue in my book is that the challenge is to push the critique of Eurocentrism further, arguing that the categories, the organizing categories of modern geography, including categories such as the sea, the ocean, the region, are neither objective nor neutral. They indeed belong to a specific discursive formation that takes shape with the birth of the human sciences in early 19th century Europe, in which history and geography emerge as disciplines. Historicism, in other words, was always a geohistoricism. And the sea, the coherence of the sea, as we've seen with Hegel, but I deal with numerous other scholars in the book, the sea featured prominently in this structure from the very start. We have here then seen a dynamic Ottoman Red Sea, well grounded in the longue durée, juxtaposed paradoxically with its scholarly marginalization as a historical subject. This tension led me to reflect on the very organizing category itself. Because, as my research has shown, the sea is a concept of fairly recent constitution, and with an increasingly weighty discursive baggage. The extensive Ottoman records of the what at the time was the Prime Minister's archives in Istanbul, now the presidential archives, revealed indeed a complete absence in Ottoman documents prior to the 19th century of the category Red Sea. Nowhere was there any evidence of the historical presence of that internal Ottoman lake as a unified subject in the archives. In none of the documents examined in search of remnants that could be used as evidence in the reconstitution of its past existence did the category Red Sea make an appearance. None until the age of European hegemony, that is, when the term Bahri Ahmer, literally the translation of the Red Sea, or also sometimes in the form the Kızıldeniz, more common now in Turkish, only in the second half of the 19th century does this term become ubiquitous. There were indeed many seas and many names in what we now identify as the Red Sea. The Red Sea, in other words, and this is another argument in the book, had to be produced as a scientific object. And this process took place under particular historical circumstances. The extension of European colonial power over the region, notably British colonial power, over the region by way of the Indian Ocean and the Eastern Mediterranean, and over the globe more largely. My argument then is that any historical study that takes the sovereign sea as a neutral historical concept and an innocent geographical space will reproduce components of Eurocentric thought. However, often we can claim that we have reached a post-ideological age. The most common designation to appear in Ottoman documents for parts of, and this is crucial, parts of the maritime domains that we now identify as the Red Sea was Bahri Suez, named obviously after the port city through which Ottoman power was projected onto the northern parts of this space. Such a simple observation may not at first glance seem to be of great importance. I want to suggest that it is, and that this apparently simple semantic shift necessitates the reassessment of basic assumptions about space and time. The objective, which I try to achieve in one of the chapters of this book, the objective is to explore the potentiality of a history written without the weight of Eurocentric geohistoricism, opening the path onto a more evocative genealogical history, one composed of fissures and breaks, in which time is not chronometric and space is not homogeneous. Such an exploration might even evoke the possibility of imagining a different relationship to the world around us. A world made up of inhabited and meaningful places, constituted by many layers and types of beings, by things and texts, rather than bounded and fenced units or categories that can be subjected to the implacable logic of the market or of the state, or indeed of history and geography. In this sense, the investigation and my work more generally tries to make Ottoman, African, and Arab history meet post-colonial thought. The unexpected result is that one may very well find inspiration in the Ottoman past for ethical quests in the present. What I am suggesting is that Ottoman history may provide stimuli for a different way of being in the world today. And here I'm thinking particularly of various projects all around the post-Ottoman seas that have sought to stave off the encroachment of privatization and gentrification of the shore. I'm thinking of the Between Two Seas walking route, studied and pioneered by Serkan, can't remember his last name at the moment, right here in Istanbul. I'm thinking of a project by the Dictaphone Group in Beirut called The Sea is Mine. Never has this been more urgent than today, when the whole world seems to be crumbling and drowning all around us. But that is a different story. Thank you very much for your attention.
Alexis, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate that. It's really, really, how can I say? I think one of the reasons I've been looking forward to this presentation of yours is because it touches on a lot of issues that, yeah, I'm being selfish, really relate to a lot of the research I'm doing. So it's really great to see how you're integrating them and honestly, like creating a maritime cultural landscape of the Red Sea, which, as you say, has been unfortunately, neglected. So it's really nice to see what you're doing. I really appreciate it. Now, of course, This is a great time for comments, questions, discussion. I could take some sort of priority as the chair of the event, but are there any particular questions that people would like to ask? Please feel free to post questions either in the chat, or if you want to ask him directly, you can try and raise your hand and hopefully I can see you. I have to say, I can't see you all. Well, I have a question because I was actually writing some notes furiously. So it's at one point, Alexis, you mentioned how there was a perceived, I think you called it like an incompatibility between Islam and the sea. And in research that I've done, when I've been looking at like late Roman, Byzantine, Middle Byzantine history, that is also a theme or kind of a trope that I see as well. But I always felt there was some sort of prejudicial aspect to it. Do you really feel that there's some sort of incompatibility there, or that's just a historical theme that no one has really challenged?
Oh no, Matthew, thank you. First of all, thank you for your kind words and for the question. Let me clarify immediately that this is not at all something that I subscribe to,
Okay.
but simply that I um, describe rather, and that I think
Okay.
is part of the heritage that we have that we face as historians of the non-European world, actually more largely, and of the um, Oriental, Islamic, African worlds, Arab, Ottoman, etc. worlds more specifically, where there's a long tradition that has been very ingrained and very yeah, but very kind of anchored, to use a maritime metaphor, that sees that incompatibility between Islamic civilization, whatever that means, and seagoing practices. Of course, I find it absolutely non-convincing and indeed profoundly racist, to put it as simply as can be.
Yeah.
But I was just noticing that that kind of historiographical legacy that I think does inform a lot of the type of work that is or that has been done on Ottoman history and Arab history more largely, and Islamic history, that sees that kind of rift between these cultures and maritime activity.
Yeah.
Which the
Okay.
record does not actually, does not confirm in any way, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even based upon my minimal knowledge of like say Arab seafaring in the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, they were incredibly active, really like the 7th, 8th centuries onward. So it was just
Absolutely.
surprising to hear that. So yeah, we feel the same way clearly. So oh, sorry, I see a question there from VOL.
Yes, thank you, Alex, for your presentation. I read your book and I quoted, and I'm very agree with you that Red Sea is not only an Ottoman lake between Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, and also I'm completely disagree with the idea that Islam and the sea is not are two contradictory notion. And in my forthcoming book on Ottoman Mediterranean at Brill, I quote you, and I want to ask you anyway, because a question for jurists, Ottoman jurists, is what the legal notion can be applied to the sea. Red Sea was a Dar al Islam or not? And if I remember, Halil Inalcik cited the prohibition of war demonstration in close proximity to Ottoman ports in the late 17th century. Do you have another evidence before, in 16th and 17th century?
Very good question. But nothing off the top of my head. That said, in the documents that I deal with, mainly I haven't explored extensively the jurisprudential literature on these aspects, but certainly in the period that I have studied the most, so the late 18th century and early 19th century, or second half of the 18th century, and it happens earlier too. There is certainly a great concern in Istanbul and in Cairo and elsewhere, but in Istanbul in particular, about protecting and maintaining that connection between Suez and Jeddah, and maintaining the integrity, if you want, of the northern part of the Red Sea, and preventing basically European traffic in the northern part of the Red Sea, for reasons of obviously the threat to the Mecca and Medina and Jeddah, but also because of its local actors, both in the Hijaz and in Cairo, that were very keen on maintaining the monopoly, basically, on the traffic and the trade between Jeddah and Suez, which was extremely profitable. So there's definitely material in the archives very explicitly preventing or menacing European ships from entering the northern part of the Red Sea.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations.
I don't know if that answers your question, but I'll think more about the kind of jurisprudential dimension of it.
Okay, thank you.
So Arlene
Fleming, and I look forward to your book, which sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's just been announced in the Ottoman Empire and its Heritage series, and I'm waiting the PDF proof. And thank you.
So Arlene Fleming has posted a question in the chat. Alexis, I'm not sure if you have access to the chat or not. If not, then I can simply read it out if you'd like.
I do, I think. Yes. Are there suggestions on how to conceptualize and organize a new approach to history and culture that will provide understanding and guidance now and in the future? Well, obviously, this is a book of history, an academic, and it tries to stay within that domain as much as possible. That said, I do think it is it's urgent to imagine new pasts and that connect to new to possible futures. And I do think that moving away from a managerial understanding of space, which I identify with the kind of colonial, modern colonial order of things, is one way to evoke possibilities of relating to space in different ways. I realize it's a little bit abstract, so it's not. I don't offer, policy guidelines in this book, but I do think it's worthy of reflection. These abstractions are worthy of and indeed necessary for moving forward, basically, and precisely staving off any managerial understanding of spatiality, which can be reduced to a two-dimensional map and transformed into an object of control, whether by the state or the scholar or, and most savagely, by the market, of course, and usually a combination of all three. Does that answer the question?
Arlene, what do you think? Or perhaps it simply brought up more questions, inevitably.
And again, there, again, there, I think there are happenings on the ground that point in that direction. So the dictaphone group in Beirut, it's a group of artists. It's not, it didn't change policy, obviously, but it did articulate the notion of this is our sea in Beirut. This is Bahr Beirut. It's not just a portion of the Mediterranean or something. It's our sea. And I think the Between Two Seas project that seeks to reimagine the relationship that Istanbulus have to this space between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara is also evidence of that resistance and that claim, that kind of claim of people against the managerial projects of space, kind of thing.
All right. There's another question in the chat, but before we get to that, I think Charles, you have a question? Charles Gagnier?
Yep, thank you very much, Alexis, for your great presentation. I just had one question. Because of the wealth of information you can find, especially about the Hejaz in the various archives center you have dealt with, did you feel at the moment of the realization of your research the risk that the Hejaz was too much present in in this history, in a kind of Hejaz, let's see, history instead of a complete racism? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. That's a very good question. And yes, and I make that explicit actually at the beginning of the book. I'm not claiming, I haven't claimed that I have reached the point of post-ideological history where I can reveal the Red Sea in its plenitude, right? What I'm saying is that this yearning for a post-ideological history needs to be contested, I think, more largely. Definitely, my sources are biased, and they come from, it's an imperial, I mean, these are imperial bureaucrats at the end of the day, sitting in Istanbul or in Cairo or in the Hejaz for that matter. And it's that triangle that very much dominates the lens through which I was able to approach the Red Sea. So yes, very much, it very much is. But I don't claim to speak for all of the denizens who have crossed the sea or live by its shores or inhabited in many ways. And I think there would be, there's great potential and great work to be done on that front as well. So definitely my sources are provide an imperial lens rather than anything else, and an imperial lens in which that the Hejaz is obviously most important. The Hejaz and other elements, but the Hejaz in particular, the coffee is another one that completely dominates. So the provisioning in coffee, which is a Red Sea commodity par excellence, is also very common in the imperial documents. They don't want the interruption of the provisioning of coffee to reach Cairo and then Istanbul. So that's also another bias of these sources, of course.
Thank you very
much.
But
yes, indeed. And that's why, and part of the argument is that the Ottomans, so the reason for which Bahri Suez is the most common term used in the Ottoman documents is precisely because that is the Ottoman point of projection of power. It's in Suez that they have a garrison, and Suez that they have an arsenal, and that they build ships, in fact, not in sufficient quantity, but they try to. And it's Suez that matters to them most, and that connection between Suez and Jeddah that is crucial to the imperial bureaucrats that I'm reading. But yes, very good question, of course.
Excellent. Thank you, Charles. There's another question in the chat from Virginia.
Yes, if I understand you correctly, Virginia Ojam, the category of Eurasia as a subverting the exceptionalism of Europe and of European history.
Yes, yes, yes. I meant it as a question for you, Alex. If
Yeah.
you're starting to see that as well.
Yes, indeed. I think there are. Yes, so the short answer is yes, indeed. The longer answer is that I think there are still inequalities, let's say, in the field, of course, and the connections between notably the southern zones of the empire, let's say in the case of the Ottoman Empire, and those connections remain underexplored, I think, to some extent. Does that make sense? But I do think that the unicity and the exceptionalism of Europe is being undermined by recent scholarship, and notably by a reimagining of geographical categories, such as the emergence of the notion that Eurasia is the category that we should be thinking with, rather than Europe exclusively.
Yes, you perhaps know I've been working on knowledge transfer and military affairs most of the last 20 years. And what's come to my attention is that military historians are gradually giving up your notions of Europe and its maritimicity. I don't think I got that right. And talking about the impact of the Ottoman zones on Europe itself in terms of governance, in terms of the way Europe evolves. So I see there is a gradual shift, and it's really about hegemony still, about who's in charge. But the EU and the military historians writing, understanding how the Chinese dealt with all their nomadic populations on the northern border, is having a large influence in the way I'm trying to think about Ottoman governance. And so I just put that in as a suggestion that maybe there is a possibility of being a historian also rethinking geography.
No, absolutely. I didn't, and you're right. I wouldn't want to overstate my case either. I perhaps drew.
No, I liked your case.
Boundaries.
I liked your case.
I perhaps drew the boundaries a little bit too sharply, and of course, there has been fantastic work throughout the ages, actually, but on many of these questions, without a doubt. It's
a fact that military history was kind of tucked into its own little, well, outside major disciplines, because nobody in North America wanted to deal with it. But now that violence has become a major subject, world subject for all of us, I think this allows us to sort of level.
It's making a comeback.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. No, absolutely. I think there's also amazing comparative work that's being done.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a lot. There's still a lot to do and a lot to think with. As I said, notably, or including in the southern zones of the southern borderlands and the eastern borderlands of the empire, both maritime and riverian and terrestrial.
Right. The late Ottoman Empire, Abdul Hamid's period in Baghdad and Iraq, the Centennial World War I opened up all kinds of ways of thinking about the Hijaz, I think, that I hope lots of students are jumping on.
Indeed. And relations with other polities in the region too, I think would be valuable to think with the connections between Istanbul and the Imam of Sana'a, for example, who I mentioned. That remains a field that would, I think, warrant much more exploration, including for maritime affairs, and including if only for the question of coffee, for example, on which Istanbul was and Cairo was so dependent, and everywhere else. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
We've got another question in the chat from Engin.
Engin Hocam, thank you very much for the comment. And yes, absolutely. I think I've always found great inspiration from literature and novels of all sorts, including the ones you mentioned. Yes, indeed. The short answer is yes. I think good novels should be the best inspiration for historians, more largely, not just in the case of Mediterranean or Indian Ocean histories, but more largely, I think it is and ought to be our inspiration. And indeed, since you're here, our dear and much regretted common friend Abdurrahim Abu Hussein would teach the history of the Ottoman Arab provinces through novels of various sorts, and I think that was always of great inspiration to me. Thank you very much for the question, Engin Hocam.
And we have another one. Everita, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your talk, Alex. Greetings from New York City. I'm not a historian. I am a political scientist, and I mostly work on genocides and ethnic conflicts. But in that work, there's usually recognition that a lot of, especially Middle European kind of ethnic nationalist thought equates Europeanness or equates specific national identity with boundedness to land, to agriculture, to peasant lifestyle. And so this is a theme we observe, at least in studying certain kinds of nationalisms, including, even further in more kind of unique ideologies like Khmer Rouge's New People, right? So it was fascinating to hear you talk about this perception of Europe as being a maritime culture. And so I was wondering, I mean, one, just a comment, I always enjoy these kind of contradictions in the way that the self and the other are defined and sort of overlap and seemingly run counter at the same exact time in the same exact space. But I'm just wondering whether in kind of post-Ottoman landscape, anyone has claimed Red Sea in a way for their nationalist projects, the way that Germans have claimed certain parts of country for their nationalist projects, and many others, of course, not just Germans. I realize this is outside of perhaps your historical interest area, but maybe in your research on the Red Sea, you have come across something more that equates to that linking of nationalism and particular notion of a geographical space or even a kind of more ideological / geographical space.
Thank you very much for the comment and the question. It's making me think. And I too very much appreciate and am fond of these kind of paradoxical contradictions that cohabitate, sometimes neatly, sometimes less so. In terms of the claiming of the Red Sea, there are various, so there have been various attempts to impose some sort of cultural hegemony over certain parts of the sea by all of the actors involved, or by all of the neighboring states, but also by Turkey itself, for example, which has invested, well, now it's all a little bit more complicated, but had agreed with the Sudanese government to rebuild and rehabilitate Sawakin, which I mentioned, on the port as a port city of the Red Sea, which had been displaced, if you want, in importance by the neighboring Port Sudan over the course of the 20th century in terms of the access to the Sudanese port onto the Red Sea. But Turkey had agreed with the Sudanese government to invest and rebuild Sawakin as a major project, both for tourism, but also, of course, building on the long Ottoman heritage that was embodied in the place, in the buildings themselves of Sawakin, and of course the cultural features that go with it. It was a main route for the pilgrimage from the African shores of the land to the Hejaz. So Turkey also was invested alongside many of the other regional players. But I don't think there is the same, and this is something I also evoke briefly in the book, I don't think there's the same mystique with the Red Sea as with the Mediterranean, for example, or the Black Sea or the Baltic or other places that have been claimed by political projects of various sorts, for a number of reasons, partly geographical, partly ideological. It doesn't have that same cachet, let's say, as so the attempt to ground Turkish history and foreign policy and identity in the Mediterranean, in the Mavi Watan, you know, the blue homeland doctrine, and the grounding it in the Mediterranean is much stronger than the appeal, I think, to and of course for obvious reasons of proximity and importance, no doubt also, but also because of that cachet that the Mediterranean has, I think. Does that answer the question? But definitely there's that there's a bizarre contradiction or paradox between the profound and deep-seated landedness of European nationalisms of various sorts, the terroir tradition in France, or of course, and in Anatolia too, there's a very strong sense of the landedness of Anatolia. But there's also an attempt to embrace the horizon that comes with maritimity and the sea in various ways. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's made me think. Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually similar to something I was going to ask, but we're actually at a point this evening where we have time for one more question, but we are also running out of time. Is there any other last questions anyone would like to ask before we stop dominating Alexis's time this evening and let him eat some dinner? Anything else at the end? I don't see any hands. I don't see anything new in the chat. In that case, then, if I'm chairing this event, I'm afraid I'm going to take it upon myself to say, Alexis, thank you very much.
Thank
It
you.
was a great talk. It was really wonderful. It was a nice change of pace. And as I said, I'm going to be watching this repeatedly to take a lot of your ideas into my own research. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions and thanks.